So, I had conducted a session on last Sunday, that was 30th of April, and we had covered some more topics related to Java Basic with the participants, of course. But unfortunately, the recording of that particular day, had some issues, and I was not able to upload the recording on my YouTube channel. So I have to redo that again today without the participants, of course. But I'll try to cover whatever I had, you know, uh, explained in my previous session. Okay, having said that, let's get started. So, I have created a folder, a project by the name Day 2, and I had also created a package called as Java Practice. Package is nothing but it's a kind of a subfolder inside which you will place all your class files. Okay, so I'll delete the ones that I had created earlier, and I'll start this session fresh. So I'll create a Java class. Okay, I'll name it day 2 practice. Okay, and I'll select this checkbox public static void main so that this main method will be created for me. All right, so let's quickly see what we are going to cover in today's session. So we are going to cover loops, arrays, final keywords, okay, and break and continue keywords as well. So break and continue, I will cover it along with the loops session. Okay, so I will do that. And in the previous session, which was day 1, we had gone through the basics of Java. We have discussed overview of what is class, what is method in Java, what is main method, what is system.out.println statement does, what is the difference between print and println statement. Then we saw what is a variable, which is nothing but a placeholder whose value can change at runtime, right? We saw how to declare and initialize a variable, print variables. We also saw different types of data types, right? Primitive as well as non-primitive. We also saw how to, convert a data type from small to large and large to small, right? So we saw both of them. Then we saw the different types of operators: arithmetic, assignment operator, comparison, logical, and we ended with conditional statements, which was nothing but if else statement and switch statement, right? So if you want to go through this particular topic again, you can refer to the video which I have already shared on my YouTube channel, so you can go through that. So without wasting further time, I'll get started with the first topic for today, which is final keyword. All right, so we have seen already what is a variable, right, and how to declare and initialize a variable, right? And what is the main feature of variable? It is that its value can change at runtime, right? So we had seen something like declaring a string variable, naming it as name equals to, let's say, Ravi. Okay, and I simply going to print this particular variable on the console window. So I'll do that by writing the statement system.out.println, and I will mention the variable name, correct? So okay, my Eclipse is behaving a little weird. Let's wait for some time. Okay, so now let's say I change the name of this variable from Ravi to Sachin. Okay, and then again print the same variable, right? And let me execute this, and obviously, this is no rocket science, right? So it will first print Ravi because that was the name of this variable, and then since we have changed the name, or since we have changed the value of this name variable, it will print you the updated value of that variable, right? So pretty straightforward. Now take a look. If I add a final keyword before this, variable declaration and initialization, if I just add a final keyword to it, what happens is that now the same placeholder which was storing a value that can change at runtime, this time its value will not change. It will remain constant, correct? So, as the name suggests, right, final, so it is a final value, it cannot change, correct? So that is why when we try to change the value of this particular placeholder, now it gives me an error. So when I hover my mouse over this, it tells me you cannot change. The final local variable name cannot be assigned. So I cannot change the value, or I cannot assign a new value to this final local variable. And it also gives you a quick fix. What does it say? Remove final modifier of this particular attribute name. So if I remove this final keyword, it is going to treat it as a variable like what it was doing previously. But now, since we want to understand what this final keyword does, that is why I've added it over here, so that it will tell you exactly, you know that we cannot change the value of this particular attribute any further, because we have now added the final keyword to it, right? So this was about final keyword. you know Pretty straightforward and simple, right? So there's nothing much to this. And final, by the way, can be used as a modifier for an attribute, or it can be also used for a method. Okay, so I will tell you how do you use that while you declare a method, and what is the advantage of using a final keyword for a method. So I will explain that in our OOP concept. Okay, so let's proceed further. So now let's directly jump on to loops. So now what is loop, correct? So loop, as a name suggests, or if you refer to an English dictionary, loop is nothing but an activity that occurs multiple times. Okay, so anything that you do multiple times, the same thing over and over again, it is called looping. So in context of Java, so whatever line of Java code that you want to execute multiple times for a certain number of time, or until a particular condition is satisfied, that is called as loop in Java. Okay, so there are different ways or different types of looping statements in Java. So the first one is called as the while loop. Okay, so we will go one by one. There are different types of looping statements available in Java. We will start with while loop. So the syntax of while loop is something like this. While, okay, you give certain expression over here, okay, I'm just providing a syntax. I will then change or add the exact content later. Okay, so here you will mention s- you know steps which needs to be repeated if the expression returns true. Okay, so if this particular expression, whatever I have written, if that particular expression returns the value as true, then whatever steps that I've mentioned inside this particular curly braces will be repeated, and it will repeat until this expression returns false. So the moment it returns false, it will come outside this loop and it will proceed with the next line of code. Okay, so now let me explain this with a simple example. I've created an integer variable, let's say a, okay, or let me give some logical name, let's say count. All right, and the count is 0 to start with. And I'll say while count is less than 5, okay, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm just doing some basic coding here just to explain you the concept. In real time, you are going to write some complex lines of code using the same concept. Okay, so for now, just for explaining what loops are, what is the syntax of writing a while loop, how does it function, I'm giving you a very basic layman example. Okay, so and I'm using this concept which we have already covered in our previous session. So we have already covered how to declare and initialize a variable. We have also covered, you know, the comparison operator, isn't it? So we are using this topics that we have already covered, and we are utilizing it for understanding these new topics. Okay, so now what is the value of the variable count? It is 0, right? So now if you come at this particular line, or basically if we come at this particular line of code, what does it say? It says while count is less than 5. So is 0 less than 5? Of course it is, right? So then this is going to return me the value as true. You remember the comparison operator in an expression will return either true or false, a boolean value, right? So this has returned me the value as true in this case. So it will go inside this while loop and it will do whatever I mention it over here. Okay, so I will say count, or let me put it this way, count is count. Okay, and along with that I will say count plus plus. So what is plus plus? Plus plus is called as the increment operator. Okay, I believe I forgot to mention this in the previous session where we covered the different types of operators. So there are two more, or there's one more type of operator which is called as increment or decrement operator. So when I say count plus plus, it is nothing but, in other words, it is count is equal to count plus 1. Okay, so it is going to return or add one more, it is going to add 1 to the existing value of this variable count. So it is going to add 0 plus 1, which is 1, right? So you can either write it in this way, or to simplify the code you can use the increment operator, which is count plus plus. Similarly, if you want to, you know use minus 1, if you want to deduct 1 from the existing value of a variable, you can use a decrement operator, which is nothing but count minus minus, which is again same as writing count is equal to count minus 1. Okay. However, in this example, I want to use an increment operator, count plus plus. All right. And I will say this out outside while loop. A very basic line of code. So what we are doing is nothing but initializing a count variable as 0. We are using a while loop which will first check whether this count is less than 5 or not. If it is less than 5, which is what in this case, it will go inside the loop and it will go to print count is and then the actual value of the count variable, which is 0. And now in the next line, it is also going to increment the value of count by 1. So it will become 1, right? And then again, it will come back to line number 11 and it will validate whether 1 is less than 5. Yes, it is. So it has returned the value as true. So again, it will go inside this loop and it will keep on doing it until this particular expression returns the value as false. So when will it return the value as false? When the value of count variable becomes 5. So when it is 5, so 5 is not less than 5, right? So it is actually 5 is equal to 5. So when the value of count becomes 5, this particular expression would return false and it will not go inside this loop, and it will simply come out and it will say outside the while loop. Okay, so we will execute this just to confirm our understanding is correct or not. And here we go. So count is 0, count is 1, count is 2, count is 3, count is 4, and it has not printed count is 5, right? Why? Because when the value of count is 5, as we discussed before, 5 is not less than 5, so it will not go inside this loop. So it has not printed count is 5, rather it has come outside this while loop and it has printed outside the while loop. So the expression is getting evaluated or validated in the beginning of this loop. If the expression returns true, then the loop starts. All right. So this is the way a while loop works. Okay. So let's move on to the next type of loop, which is called as do while loop. This is again similar to what we have just seen, but with a little variation. So we will take the same example, rather, I will copy paste the same thing with a little twist. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is, or the syntax of do while loop itself is, you will say do and you will open the braces, the curly braces of the loop. You will copy paste whatever lines of code you want to run in that loop, and then in the end you will validate the expression. Okay. So now what does this tell you? Any guesses? Okay. So it basically tells you that this particular loop will execute at least once. Okay. So no matter whether the expression returns true or false, it will, this loop will execute at least once, and then for the second iteration, if the expression returns the value as false, it will come outside the loop. Or if the expression returns the value as true, the second iteration of the loop will get executed, right? So this is the only difference between a while loop and a do while loop. To explain you, let me put it this way. Okay, I have just modified the value of the variable count as 8, and now if you see, it says do. It is not validating the expression at this particular line of code, right? So by default it will go inside this loop, it will print the value as count is 8. It will increment the value of the count variable by 1, so it will become 9. And then at this particular point it will now validate the expression which says count is less than 5. So now when the value of count is 9, is it less than 5? No, right? So it is going to return the expression as false, correct? So now when it returns as false, it will not go back inside this do loop. Rather, it will come outside and it will say outside the do while loop. Okay. I hope it is making sense. It's pretty simple. I'm trying to keep the example as straightforward, as simple as possible, so that is it is easier to understand. Okay. So let me execute this. Right. So it says the value of count variable is 8. It has gone inside this do loop by default. It has printed count is 8. Correct. It has incremented it by 1. I'm sorry. So it has become 9. So count is less than 5, meaning is 9 less than 5? No, right? So it will come outside the do while loop and it will say outside the do while loop. It has not gone again inside this do while loop, correct? So now let's say, uh, let me put it as 3. Okay. So now the value of my variable is 3. So now let's see what happens. Will it go for the second and third iteration? Yeah, ideally it should, right? So let us see what happens. Correct. So first it went inside the loop by default, irrespective of checking whether the value is less than 5 or not. So by default, count is 3 has to get printed. Okay, there's no doubt about it. Correct. So now when the value of count gets increased by 1, which becomes 4, it validates whether 4 is less than 5. Since this expression has returned true this time, so it has gone for the second iteration and it has printed the value count is 4. Then again, the counter has been increased by 1, so it has become 5. So is 5 less than 5? It returned false. So then finally it has come outside the do while loop and it has printed outside the do while loop. Okay, so basic stuff, isn't it? Now there's one important thing to remember whenever you use a loop, whichever loop, the while loop, the do while loop, or the for loop that we will see later. One thing that we need to ensure that the loop should not go into infinity. Okay, it should stop at certain point of time, right? What I mean by infinity is that if we do some programming error, okay, let's say this, okay, the value of count variable is 3. It will first by default go inside the do while loop. It will print the value of count as whatever 3. Now what I'm doing is I'm decrementing the value of the variable count by 1, so which will be 2, right? So now it will say, is 2 less than 5? Yes, it is, right? So it will again go inside the do loop. It will again further decrement it by 1. So since we are decrementing it, and we are validating the expression, hoping that it will eventually reach a value that would return the expression as false, but it will never happen, right? Because it will never get incremented to 5. It is always getting decremented, right? So this is going to go in an infinite loop, which will hamper you know your computer memory. It will keep on utilizing, and this particular code will keep on getting executed forever. Okay, so that is not our intention of using a loop in any programming language, right? But just to show you what I mean by infinite loop, let me execute this and show it to you. You will never see this statement getting printed outside the do while loop, because it will always go inside the do while loop. Okay, so let's check it out. Here you see how fast it is getting decremented by one, right? And it will continue for the rest of your life. So you have to forcibly terminate this, correct? And that is the power of loops. You can either use it for good, or you can literally create havoc in your programming. Sure, so let's move ahead. We have covered do while loop as well. So there's one more type of loop, what we call it as for loop. Now I'll show you how for loop works. What is the syntax of for loop? So syntax for loop is pretty simple. So whatever you have done earlier, wherein you declare a variable, you initialize it, you use an expression, and then you either increment or decrement that particular variable, so that you know the loop would have the starting and the ending point, right? So we have all of these in three different lines, right? So you declare and initialize it in one, you use the expression at some other line, and then you increment or decrement it on the third line, right? However, in the case of for loop, all of that is taken care in one single line. So the syntax goes something like this: for declare a variable int I, or let's continue with this, int count equals to 0, count is less than 5, and count plus plus. Then you open your curly braces, sorry, and then you do whatever stuff you want to do in loop, right? So I'll follow the same example so that you are able to relate all these three loops, correct? I'll just copy paste this. So for loop, your declaration and initialization of the variable happens here, then you add a semicolon, and then you give the expression which you want to validate, then you again add a semicolon, and then you provide whether you want to increment the variable or decrement it. Okay, and then in curly braces you add whatever you want to execute in loop, right? So this is the syntax of for loop. So now I'm going to execute this, and it will work exactly the same way what we had seen for while loop or do while loop, right? So it started with count 0, It continued until the expression returned the value as true. The moment it returned the expression value as false, it has come outside the loop and it has printed the statement outside the for loop. Correct? So this was about the for loop. There is one more loop which is called as the for each loop. Okay, so I will touch base on this in a while after I cover the array concept. But I hope you are with me till now in understanding these three types of loops. Okay, so now we will quickly see what is break and continue keywords. These are used. I think you must have already seen break keyword in the previous session for the switch statement, right? Okay, so we are going to use break and continue keyword in these loops as well. Okay, so I'll tell you exactly what is the difference. So let's say I'm saying if count is equal to 3, I have to use equal double equal to because I'm validating, or I'm evaluating whether this count variable has the value 3 or not, right? So that is why I have to use two double equal to. If I use a single equal to, it will be it will treat it as an assignment operator, which I don't want, right? So it will be two double equal to. If count is equal to 3, I would say pick, right? Let's see what happens in this case. We are starting with the value 0, and I'm saying continue this for loop until the count value is less than 5. Okay, so ideally it should go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, correct, and then it should come outside the for loop. Now since we have added this additional check using an if condition and we have mentioned break keyword, now let's see how this particular same loop works this time. All right, so what it has done is that the loop has broken, or you know the compiler has come outside the for loop in just 3 iteration. So the moment the value of count has reached 3, it has gone inside this if statement and it has executed this break keyword. So what break does is that it abruptly stops the for loop, or for that matter any loop. You can use the same logic in do while loop or while loop as well. So what it does basically, it abruptly stops the loop and it comes out of it, and then it has printed the statement which is outside the loop, which says outside the for loop. You're getting my point? So break basically abruptly comes outside the loop, right? Now we will see what is continue statement. Okay, so it is something similar but with a little difference. Okay, so I'll explain you this now by executing the same code. All right, so now what has happened, as you can see, it has printed count is 0, count is 1, count is 2, everything is fine until now, but it has not printed count is 3, and it has neither you know taken you outside the loop immediately. So it has gone ahead inside the loop again but it has skipped this particular iteration. So the iteration when the value of count was 3 was not executed, it has not printed. So it has skipped whatever line of code is there in this loop, okay, and it has gone to the next iteration. When the value of count was 4, it has come inside, it has continued the loop, and then, naturally when the loop ends, it has gone outside the for loop and it has printed outside the for loop. So count what continue does is that it skips the iteration and continues with the next iteration of the loop. You understood the difference between break and continue? I hope so, because you know it's very basic. Again, I am saying that over and over again because it's actually very basic. There's no rocket science. You just have to follow along with me and you will be able to understand the concept. Okay, so with this we have completed the final keyword, the loops, and the break and continue keywords. So now let's move on to arrays. Okay, so I will create a new class for this array, public static void main. All right, so until now you have seen a variable storing one value in the placeholder. Okay, so you can say string employee or emp name, you know which stores employee name would be Ganesh, right? It will store only one value, isn't it? It's not possible for a variable to store more than one value. You can obviously replace the existing value of a variable, which we have already seen, but you cannot store more than one value at any given point of time. So to overcome this, Java has a concept called as an array. Now, how do you use an array? So array is nothing but a variable that has uh, that has a capacity to store multiple values. It can be a string value, it can be an integer value, it can be byte value, float value, you name it, and you can store all of these values in a single variable. Okay, so how do you do that? I'll explain right now. Okay, so how do you declare an array? You can declare and initialize an array in the same line like this: string, you have to mention the data type, you mention open and close square braces, which indicates that this is an array. You can give the name as emp or employee name, okay, equals to, and you can quickly give those names over here. So let's say Roy, Satish, you can say Anuja, close the curly braces and add a semicolon. Right. Why is it giving me an. Okay. So What basically I've done is I have declared a string array. The name of the array is employee name, and it is storing three values in it: Roy, Satish, and Tanuja. Okay, so this is similar to what you declare and initialize a variable in single line, right? I purposely kept this also so that you can compare the difference between declaring and initializing a variable whereas declaring and initializing an array. There is also another way of declaring and initializing an array. You know, instead of doing it in one single line, you can also do something like this. Okay, so you can do string array employee name equals to new string, and you will say 3. So what basically I'm trying to tell the Java compiler is that I want you to create an string array by the name employee name, which will store three string values. Okay, so this is the length of the array which you have defined. Okay, and then you can add those three values one by one by giving the index. Okay, so the index of an array always starts with 0, right? So employee name at index 0 would be Roy, and then I'll copy paste this for the other two values as well. The index for the second one would be 1, and the third one it will be 2. I hope you are understanding what I'm trying to do. So I have done the same thing which I have done at line number 8, but I've done it in two different, you know, lines. One is declaring it and then initializing it. Similar to what you can do for a string variable also. So you can either declare and initialize a string variable in one line, or you can first declare string variable, correct, and then you can initialize it on the second line. So this is also perfectly fine, right? So similarly for array, you can declare an array in one line and then initialize the array in the subsequent lines, or you can might as well, do all of that in one single line. Both are perfectly fine. Okay, so yeah, coming back to array, I hope now you are understanding this same variable is now capable of storing more than one value, whereas a normal string variable, or any variable for that matter, is capable of storing only one value, correct? So now you have multiple methods in an array. So if you remember, in our previous session, we had mentioned that there are some primitive data types which are inbuilt data types, whereas there are non-primitive data types such as string, arrays, and classes. So these are non-primitive data types because these can be, you know, defined by the user, and it also has certain specific methods. So this is an array class, and a class always have some methods associated with it. So how do you access the method of a particular class? By adding a full stop, and then you can see all the methods that are available for this particular class. So it is, there are many. There is a length method which is going to return you the length of the array. So now if I have to print the length of the array, right? So what I'm going to do is that I can say length of this array is, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print length of this array is, and then I'm going to access this array variable, and I'm going to use its method called as length. So this particular method is going to return me some integer value, which I'm going to concatenate, or add it to the string that I have printed over here. Okay, so let's see this. So it says length of this array is 3, right? So this is exactly what I mentioned at the declaration itself, right? So I've mentioned that create a string array by the name employee name, which will store 3 string values, correct? Value Roy at index 0, value Satish at index 1, and value Tanuja at index 2. Okay, so now we will see how we can use a for loop for printing the value of this array. Okay, so I'll quickly show you that. For, let's say, int I equals to 0, I less than, what, less than 3, right? I plus plus, right? And then you can say sys out, and then you can say employee name I. So what basically I'm doing is I'm starting the index count as 0 with using the variable as I. I'm you know ending the index value which is less than 3, so in this case it is 2, and I will increment it one by one, and then I'm going to print the value of this particular array by accessing its index. So how do I access the value of an array? By calling the array variable name and accessing its index. So here first it will be index 0. So what is index 0? It is Roy. Then it will go as index 1, which is Satish. Then it will go as index 2, Tanuja. And when the value of I becomes 3, which is not less than 3, because I am iterating it by 1, right? So it will always increase by 1. So the moment it becomes 3, so 3 is not less than 3, so it will not print anything further, and I will say outside the for loop. So now let us see, if I execute this, what is the output. Okay, length of this array. Okay, this particular statement which we had seen earlier. So ignore this for now. So first it printed Roy, then it printed Satish, then it printed Tanuja, and then it says outside the for loop. Now rather than hard coding the value here as 3, what I can simply do is I can use this length method over here. So I will say I is equal to 0, I less than employee name dot length, which is nothing but 3, okay, and then I plus plus, correct? So meaning if I, let's say, I increase the size of the array, right, at some other point, right, and then I add another value to it, let's say Mahesh, okay. If I would have kept it as 3, hard coded over here, it would have never printed Mahesh. It would have stopped till Tanuja, correct? So, it has printed only till Tanuja. So rather than hard coding the exit point of this for loop, I would rather say employee name dot length. So no matter you add more to this or you reduce anything, it will accordingly, iterate the for loop based on the length of the array. So now if you see, it has printed Mahesh as well, and then it has come outside the for loop, right? So this was about array. So this is a single dimensional array, by the way. There is also something called as bidimensional array or two-dimensional array or multi-dimensional array, whatever you want to call it. Okay, I will show you that very quickly. Mm, Let me open an Excel and let me show you that. Uh, okay, first let me tell you how to declare a two-dimensional array. Let's say I say int two time array is equal to new int, and I will say 2 comma 2. Okay, so what I've done here is I have declared an integer array which is two dimensional because I've mentioned two square brackets over here, and the name of the array is two dim array equals to new int 2 2. So what is this 2 2? It basically means two rows and two columns. Okay, so let's imagine this. Okay, I have 0 0 or 0, maybe let me just keep it a little different. 5 3 2 6. There are two rows, which is row number 1 and row number 2, and there is two columns as well, column A and column B. So the zeroth row and zeroth column, you remember the index of an array always starts with 0. So although this is the first row, it will be the zeroth row, and although this is the first column, it will be the zeroth column. So 0 0 would return me the value as 5. Now, first row, so the row 1 and zeroth column will return me the value 2. Similarly, zeroth row and one column will return me the value as 3, and whereas one row and one column will return me the value as 6. Okay, this might be a little confusing for you because the length and then the index starts with 0, and now it is two dimensional. So how do you do all of this? It will take some time for getting a little well versed with two dimensional array. To be very honest, even I am not very well versed, but I know the concepts. And to be very frank, I have not really used two dimensional arrays that frequently in my 14 plus years of automation experience. But this is a good to know concept. You might need it, who knows, right? Or maybe you might be asked, you might get this question as an interview question, right? So it's good to always know the concepts at least, correct? So now I have created this variable array, integer array variable, which is a two-dimensional, which has two rows and two columns. So now how do I initialize it? I will say two time array zeroth row and zeroth column should have the value as, let's say, I'll try to replicate this as 5. Okay, and similarly I'm going to add the other values. Okay, so mm, yeah, let me put this way. So row number 1 and column number 0, what is the value in the Excel which we have said? Row number 1, column number 0, it will be 2, correct? So I will put it as 2. Then row number 0, column number 1 will have the value, row number 0, column number 1 will have the value as 3, correct? So I'll put it as 3 and 1 1, right? So row number 1, column number 1 will have the value as 6, correct? So we are done with initializing our array, correct? So now if you want to print this, right? So you can use nested for loop. So we will see this now. Int row equals to 0, row less than uh, length row plus plus, correct? And then I'll use another for loop for int call equals to 0, call less than them array dot length, call plus plus. Now I will say sys out two time array row and column. Okay, and then sys out outside both for loops. So now let us see what it prints, right? So what has happened here in nested for loop, I've used two for loops because I have to first iterate the row and also the column, right? So it started with zeroth row. Let's try to figure this out, okay? Theoretically, how it works. So at line number 12, it started with row as 0, the row less than two-dimensional array dot length, which is 2, okay? So zeroth row started with zeroth row or zeroth index, less than a row is less than 2 and row plus plus, and then it has directly gone in a different for loop which says column is equal to 0, column less than 2, column plus plus, and then it says system.out.println, I'm referring this array and accessing the row and column. So what is the value of row? The value of row is 0. So it is 0th row. And what is the value of column? It is 0th column. So 0 comma 0, which is this one, it printed the value as 5. Okay, so far so good, right? I understand this is a little confusing because two-dimensional array in itself is a little complex, and now to access this we are using nested for loop, so it is a little more complex to add. Okay, but just go step by step, try to understand the code, and then it will be easier for you. All right, so now it is in the second for loop, and it will iterate in the internal or the inside for loop first completely, and then it will go outside the for loop. Okay, so now the call variable is incremented by 1, so it became 1. So column is equal to 1, it is less than 2, and then it has come inside. So row is still 0, column is now 1. Okay, so row is 0, column is 1, so it is going to print me the value as 3. So it has printed 3. So now it has come outside the for loop because now the value of column is 2, which is not less than 2 in this case, right? So it has come outside the for loop, it has gone in the outside for loop. So what is the outside for loop value of row? It was 0, if you remember, and now it has got incremented by 1. So now the value of row is 1, correct, which is less than 2. Now it has again come inside the for loop. Now the value of column is refreshed to 0, right, because it has come outside the for loop and now it is again coming inside, so it will again start with 0. Row is now 1, column is 0, so it will print the value as row is 1, column is 0 as 2, correct. So it has printed it. Then now again column will go to the next iteration. It will be row 2, column 2, and it will print the value as 6. So now this particular for loop has come outside because it has breached the maximum length, and now the outside for loop has also now incremented the value of row by 1, which became as 2, and it is now no longer satisfying this condition, and then it has come outside the outside or the external for loop as well, and then it has printed the statement as outside both for loops. Okay, so you can refer to this section of this video maybe 2 3 more times to understand the two-dimensional array and the nested for loop. Okay, if you haven't understood right away, right, so you can refer to the video as many number of times as you want. So now before I end this session, I wanted to show you another type of for loop, right, which I mentioned, which is nothing but for each loop. I'll show it over here. So for each loop is used for array, or it is used for some other types of Java classes. I'll you know explain you that later, but for now I'll explain this for each loop using an array. Okay, so now you have seen how you can print the value of array using the for loop, right? So you have to declare the start point, the end point, and you have to mention the incremental statement as well, right? So instead of that, there is an easier way to access all the values of an array using the for each loop. Okay, I'll tell you the syntax. So it says for int I, you know, just like how you mentioned int equals to 0, right? Int I semi or int I colon, and then you mention the array name, or yeah, I think it is. hi. uh, Let me try this for in. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just got a little confused. Okay, so basically what the syntax says is that for each string variable. Okay, so now since my array is a string array in this particular case, so for each string variable, so you have to mention the data type string. You can refer to all of these values with some temporary variable, let's say s, and you have to add a semicolon and mention the array name over here. So in this case, it is employee name. So what it basically is trying to tell the compiler is that for each string value, you know, which it is marking it as s, okay, in the array called as employee name, you simply print that particular string, which is nothing but s. Okay, so you don't have to give the starting point or the ending point. It will automatically start with the first index and it will end with the last index, and it will print each of those values one after the other. Okay, so this is called as the for each loop. And let me print this. So you see it has printed all the values: Roy, Satish, Tanuja, Mahesh, and then it has come outside the for loop which says outside the for each loop. Correct? So this was about the for loop or the for each loop. And with this, we have covered all the topics which we have planned for today's session. We covered the final keyword, we saw all the different types of loop, we saw the break and continue keywords, and we have also seen the arrays, single and also two-dimensional arrays. I hope this session was helpful, and thank you so much.